I'm combining two reports here, one paper and one report actually. And the first one is on future warming from global food consumption. So we typically talk about emissions from food production. This is slightly different. We are looking at warming from global food consumption. Let's just read the abstract to start with. Food consumption is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, and evaluating its future warming impact is crucial for guiding climate mitigation action. However, the lack of granularity in reporting food item emissions and the widespread use of oversimplified metrics such as CO2 equivalents have complicated interpretation. We resolve these challenges by developing a global food consumption greenhouse gas emissions inventory separated by individual gas species and employing a reduced complexity climate model, evaluating the associated future warming contributions and potential benefits from certain mitigation measures. This is about the future, taking scenarios like SSP and RSP that we've been discussing and using a simplified climate models to then retroactively or post-processing the emissions with this approach and splitting it into methane, CO2 of course, and then methane and N2O, for example. Uncertainties are still the issue when you do this because you are also taking input from scenarios which themselves have tremendous uncertainty, and these uncertainties tend to dominate the future climate as you go beyond about 2050. Keeping all that in mind, we find that global food consumption alone could add nearly 1 degree C warming to by 2100. 75% of this warming is driven by foods that are high sources of methane like ruminant meat, dairy and rice. However, over 55% of anticipated warming can be avoided from simultaneous improvements to production practices, the universal adoption of a healthy diet, and consumer and retail level food waste reductions. Some of these involve especially dietary shifts or choosing healthy diets, involve behavioral changes which are always a biggest challenge for human beings. Starting with the results here, global mean surface temperature response to greenhouse gas emissions from future food consumption in degrees centigrade, and the population projections are taken from various scenarios here. So global mean surface air temperature responses to GHG emissions from future food consumption based on 5 population projections. We'll read the details in a minute, but you can see that the warming ranges just from food consumption contributions range up to about 0.9 degrees C by 2100, and there are some standard deviations or uncertainty bands shown here. So you are using scenarios like regional rivalry from shared socioeconomic pathway 3, inequality in SSP 4, middle of the road in SSP 2, fossil fuel development in SSP 5, sustainability SSP 1, and constant 2020 global population in this. Obviously this is not intuitive in the sense, why is the business as usual scenario producing lower emissions, for example? So you have to go and follow what the model actually does in terms of converting scenarios into food consumption. That's the tricky part here, and then computing emissions with a simple climate model from those emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide from food consumption were calculated using the database developed herein and the population projections developed for the following SSPs as outlined in that paper, Riahi et al. Regional rivalry, inequality, middle of the road, fossil fuel development and sustainability, which correspond to SSP 3, 4, SSP 2, 5 and SSP 1 respectively. The future warming associated with consumption from a constant 2020 global population also provided here for reference. RCP 8.5 emissions were input for all sectors other than agriculture and all forcers other than carbon dioxide. So there is some mix done here, taking SSP populations and then RCP 8.5 emissions. So you have to follow the logic by reading the paper in more detail. RSP, okay, so what else is here? I will skip the other details. The inequality scenario is identified by a dotted line to better visualize overlapping results here. So looking at the global mean surface air temperature responses attributed to individual greenhouse gas emissions, methane, carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide from future food consumption under a high population projection. Population projections were taken from the SSP3 regional rivalry population growth scenario. The results shown are the means of a 190 member ensemble. So here you have N2O, CO2 and methane. So you have global mean surface temperature response to greenhouse gas emissions from future food consumptions based on populations. So there is the emission which is related to food production, which we have talked about. Here it's about food consumption, which depends very much on population. So you need population projections, which they are mixing and matching from the SSP scenarios for future populations. So you can see again CO2 dominates. Here methane dominates because of the ruminants, rice, paddies and so on. CO2 is the second one, and then N2O adds almost a similar amount. So this is a bit counterintuitive in that sense, and that explains some of this in terms of where the warming comes from. Looking at the relative contribution of food groups to global mean surface air temperature responses to future food consumption, greenhouse gas emissions under a high population projection. Contributions are presented for the years 2030, 2050 and 2100. The pie chart here in the top right corner visualizes year 2030 percentage contributions. Population projections are again from SSP3 regional rivalry population growth scenario. So we're looking at relative contributions to global mean surface air temperature response to future food consumption, greenhouse gas emissions in degrees centigrade. Ruminant meat of course contributes the most, and the future looks brighter because 2050 and 2100 contributions to warming drop from ruminants. Similarly for rice, but largest fractional contribution comes obviously from ruminant meat and then rice and dairy. Non-ruminant meat on the other hand goes up because you are replacing these with these. So by 2100 you have higher contributions from non-ruminant meat like chicken, and that also has to be noted that these are much smaller than the ruminant meat for all future scenarios from 2030, 50 to 2100. Vegetables increase, seafood increase, they are all smaller and smaller, so grains, other, oils, beverages, eggs and fruit. What happens in 2030? You have still a lot of ruminant contributions at 33%, rice at 23%, dairy at 19%, so those are the high methane contributions that we are looking at here. And then you have non-ruminant meat and the others like fruit, eggs, beverages, oil, seafood, grains and vegetables. So you have similar pie charts for 2050 and 2100 as well. Looking now at the global mean surface air temperature responses to future food consumption, GHG emissions for mitigation strategies and still under a high population projection. Global mean surface air temperature responses to greenhouse gas emissions from future food consumption here. Looking at mitigation strategies, no mitigation is up here at just under 1 degree C. Then you have reduce retail food waste by 50%, reduce consumer food waste by 50%. Decarbonization of food production brings us down to this. Global conversion to healthy diet is good. Behavioral change will be a challenge there, so but scenarios, so you assume it happens. Maximum production improvements bring us down here, and then all mitigation methods together will reduce food consumption warming to under 0.4 degrees centigrade by 2100. Right? Obviously gives us targets to aim for. But moving on to another report from worldgrain.com, which came out of a conference, trends expected to dramatically impact agriculture in the coming years. We have to produce more with less environmental impact. So population is expected to grow by 2.2 billion people by 2050, but at the same time there is an increasing amount of pressure to lower our environmental impacts. Secondly, optimization of water use. We've got a water problem in the world and uncertainty certainly in the United States. So we got some work to do in terms of how we monitor and how we irrigate. This is from Blades, who was at the meeting. Increased global demand for protein. While discussions about lab-grown meat and plant-based meat products have gained solid market traction, Blades said there was no indication demand for animal protein would decrease. In fact, it was projected to double by 2050. There is a tricky thing in this where plant-based and lab-grown proteins are trying to emulate the taste of the meat. Does that mean that people will switch to it and reduce meat consumption? That's a tricky issue there that has to be looked at. Shorter food supply chain. We already know that local food consumption is better, food mile reduction is better, but you cannot always track food miles by yourself. So the entire food supply chain has to get shorter. Geographic shifts in production. For different reasons, both genetic advances and climate changes have allowed crops to grow in places they couldn't grow previously, but the changes are opening possibilities for farmers to diversify. Okay? Advanced food traceability helps maintain consumer trust. There have been many cases where organic, so-called organic food has been certified by third parties, so the vendors cannot guarantee that it is in fact organic. So this destroys the trust. So trust is very important in driving food habits and food choices. Farmers adjust in response to emission regulation. This is something that has to happen. So there is top-down constraints coming down in terms of emission regulations, carbon trading, carbon tax, etc. And the farmers will be forced to follow those, or those will be the trends that have to be affecting agriculture in the coming decades. Efforts to decarbonize create adjacent economies. So Blades said the US Department of Agriculture is actively pursuing opportunities to establish multiple income streams at singular farm operations by supporting the development of adjacent industries, especially for carbon markets, where farmers could generate and sell carbon credits to private sector buyers. So you need the economy itself to take care of the life cycle problems of going from food productions to meeting emissions demands and offsets and such as we go along. Obviously this is much more focused on the US, but I'm including it because these trends will affect agriculture everywhere. Connectivity gap narrows. All of the promises that we have within precision agriculture relies on constant connectivity of the internet. So this is going to require certain access, quality and quantity of bits of data that can be moved around. Artificial intelligence enables insight-driven farming. This is a technological promise that is beginning to yield gains, but like the reliance on so-called smart agriculture or precision agriculture, one has to remember that more and more data is going to be stored on clouds, and clouds are energy hogs. So if, for example, if you have a tractor running around collecting data, it's constantly doing energy consumption to manage the data, transmit the data, store the data, analyze the data to produce very current information, very local specific information, and so on. Resources pour into cybersecurity. So that's something that's also going to play into agriculture. New business models emerge. You don't have to look very far to see the money that's being poured into agriculture, Blades said. So obviously corporations are playing into it. Climate risks are going to affect food markets, weather derivatives, and so on. So all this is going to play into how business models are going to adjust to climate risks to agriculture, and how agriculture itself, the food production, food processing industry itself adjusts to how the business models have to adjust to climate risks. Okay, so it's a combination of future warming from food consumption and the trends that are going to affect food production. So I just combined them. Hopefully it's still useful. Very brief, but you can always follow up on the papers I'm citing here. Okay.